In our last discussion, we looked at what money is by explaining its core functions. We learned that money isn't just physical cash, it's anything widely accepted for transactions. But how do economists actually measure the total amount of money that's circulating in the economy? This question is particularly interesting when we consider things like money and checking accounts and different forms of how we store money in a modern economy, even in the digital forms. Is all of that considered money? The same way that I consider this $20 bill to be money. So this next section, measuring money, is going to cover those. Learning outcomes, we need to contrast M1 and M2 money supply and then classify what monies belong to M1 or M2 money supplies. So in the United States, the primary entity who is responsible for defining and measuring the money supply is the Fed, Federal Reserve Bank. Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in the following chapter. But they have many roles, and one of those is to act as a bank regulator, and they're responsible for setting and implementing monetary policy. So when it comes to defining money, the Fed primarily does so according to a concept called liquidity. So what exactly is liquidity? Well, simply put, liquidity describes how quickly and easily a financial asset can be converted into cash and then used to buy goods or services. So think about it this way. You got a $20 bill in your pocket, in your wallet. This is very liquid. This is as liquid as it gets. I can walk into any store right now and use this to buy whatever I need. That'll get me $20 worth. So this is spend-ready money, right? I can spend it right now. But now imagine you have $20 that's in a long-term certificate of deposit that's not going to mature for another year. Well, in order to use that money, you'd first have to break the CD, which could incur a penalty. And then you have to access the funds and get them into your checking account. So it's just less liquid. It's not as easily spent right now. So because financial assets vary widely in their liquidity, how spend ready they are, economists use a tiered measure of money to capture these different levels of accessibility. So based on this concept of liquidity, the Fed uses two primary definitions, M1 and M2 money supply. M1 is considered the narrower definition, which is going to include those that are the most liquid, those that are immediately available for spending. M2 is a more broader definition that includes everything in M1 plus other less liquid financial assets that can still be converted into spendable money relatively easily. So let's break down the M1 supply first. The most intuitive concept is coins and currency. This $20 bill I keep bringing up, right? That's the physical cash, the physical coins and paper bills that are in circulation that are actively being used by everybody in the economy. So this does not include money that's held by the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve itself, or inside of bank vaults. Another component of M1 is checking accounts, checking deposits at banks. These are the funds that are held in your bank and your bank checking account. They're called demand deposits because the bank is legally obligated to give you your money on demand. If you ask for it, they have to give it to you. Whether you write a check, use a debit card, or withdraw cash at an ATM, however it is you're trying to demand that money for spending, they have to make that happen. Traditionally, travelers' checks were also part of M1, but their use has declined quite a bit over time with the rise of debit cards. So now let's look at M2 money supply. This is a broader measure. It encompasses everything in M1, plus several other categories of financial assets that are less liquid than M1, but still relatively easy to access and spend if you needed to. First among these would be savings deposits. So these are bank accounts where you typically can't write a check directly. They're usually earning a little bit of interest, a very tiny amount, but you can easily withdraw that money at an ATM or a bank branch, or you can transfer it to your checking account. Then we have money market funds. These are investment accounts where the deposits of many individual investors are pooled together and invested in very safe short-term assets like government bonds. So you can't write a check directly from a money market account, but they are designed to be highly accessible if you need to access them. And then finally, we have certificates of deposit or CDs. These are called time deposits as well. And this is also included in M2. These are accounts where you commit to leaving your money in the bank for a specific period of time, ranging from a few months to maybe even several years, in exchange for a higher interest rate. So while they have a fixed term, smaller denomination certificate of deposits are still considered part of M2 because they can be converted to cash, albeit with some effort or potentially a penalty if they're withdrawn early. So, taken together, you can visualize this relationship between the two measures by thinking of M1 as the inner core of the money supply and M2 as the wider circle that encompasses M1. So, the formula for M1 is coins and currency in circulation plus checking accounts and plus savings deposits. The formula for M2 is everything in M1 plus money market funds plus certificate of deposits plus other time deposits. So it's important to note that the definition of M1 was actually updated in May 2020 by the Federal Reserve to include savings deposits. Prior to that, savings deposits were only counted in M2. And that change just reflects evolving banking practices, which we'll talk about in a moment. But core among those was the fact that nobody should be using savings accounts. They don't give you any interest. But yet, and they're very easy to access. So you could access money in your savings account about as quickly as you can from your checking account. If you have an app on your phone, you can move that money just like that, no problem. There's not a lot of barriers. There's no penalties as opposed to these other forms of supply here. So let's look at some real numbers from a recent period to get a sense of the scale. As of November 2021, the Federal Reserve reported that the total M1 money supply in the United States was $20.3 trillion. This figure was comprised of about $2.1 trillion in currency, $4.8 trillion in demand checking deposits, and a significant $13.5 trillion in savings accounts, which in my opinion should be a heck of a lot lower. People should be taking that money and investing it, but that's just me. Looking at the M2 money supply for the same time frame, it was 21.4 trillion, which is included the entire M1 supply of 19.2 plus the 0.12 trillion in time deposits and 1 trillion in money market funds. You might be wondering, why is the 19.2 trillion in M1 not the same as the 20.3 I mentioned just above? And that's just because there's some slight differences from the seasonal adjustments and the ongoing data revisions that the Fed puts out, but the overall picture is still pretty consistent. All right. So what these figures tell us is that even the broader M2 measure is overwhelmingly made up of M1 components, primarily reflecting the vast amount of money held in checking and savings accounts in our modern economy. In fact, it kind of makes me question the visual here that we just showed you. Really, if we were to redo this visual, this green circle would take up a lot more of that space, like a whole lot more. There'd only be a tiny sliver there left for the M2 money supply. But that's not, I didn't make that, so passing the buck. Now, it's worth noting that the lines that separate these can be a little blurry because of banking innovations. We talked about savings accounts. Savings accounts used to be distinctly different from checking accounts, but with online banking and new financial products, many savings accounts now allow you to write checks directly from them or to pay your bills electronically from those savings accounts. It means that money in savings accounts has become much more liquid, behaving much like money in checking accounts. This evolution in banking practices is precisely the rationale that led to the Federal Reserve to move savings deposits into the M1 definition of money in May 2022, recognizing their increased liquidity. So where does plastic money fit into this? Debit cards, credit cards, smart cards. How does that fit in? Well, it's a common point of confusion. A debit card is essentially an electronic check. When you use it, you're instructing your bank to directly and immediately transfer money from your checking account to the seller. So it's not the card itself that's money, but rather the checkable deposit in your bank account that the debit card accesses, which that part is part of M1. A credit card is different. When you make a purchase with a credit card, the credit card company immediately pays the seller from its checking account. You, as the card holder, then owe money to the credit card company. They fronted it on your behalf, basically. So now you got to pay them plus interest. So a credit card is not considered money, but rather a short-term loan from the credit card company to you. And then finally, a smart card, like some prepaid gift cards or a campus ID card that may have stored value. I think Marshall does that or used to do that. That'll store a certain value of money directly on the card itself, which you can then use for purchases. Now, these are typically limited in where they can be used. They don't always get to be used everywhere, especially those store cards. So in essence, credit cards, debit cards, smart cards, they're not money themselves, but they are different ways to move or to access money when you make a purchase. They help to facilitate transactions, but they don't add to the overall quantity of money in the economy. For instance, my credit card here from Fifth Third Bank, it's got a credit limit of $16,500. But that doesn't mean that I have $16,500 in any account anywhere. It just means that if I need to spend that amount of money, they are willing to lend me that amount of money. So that's all that is. All right, so to sum up this section, the big picture here is that modern money is largely electronic and bank-based. While coins and physical currency do still exist, the overwhelming majority of money in our economy exists as electronic records in bank accounts. Because of this, understanding bank balance sheets becomes essential. So that's going to help us, when we look at bank balance sheets in the next section, that's going to help us to understand how banks operate and how they manage their assets and liabilities. And that's good for understanding not only how monetary policy works, but also how the banking system actually creates money through its lending activities. And that's going to get us into the next section where we're going to look at what the role of banks is. And then the final section, which is how they create money through the money multiplier. All right, I will see you all over in that one. Have a good rest of your day.